Remember that whole COVID vaccine thing?
Hmm.
People driving for hours to get a specific shot, setting alarms for appointments. It was wild. It's
Yeah.
like everyone was on this quest for control. So our brains really crave that feeling, especially when making decisions. Which brings us to today's deep dive. We're looking at how our brains handle this perceived control thing. And the paper we're diving into breaks it down even further into self-efficacy and response-efficacy. So think back to that vaccine frenzy for a second. Self-efficacy was like, can I even get an
Yeah.
appointment?
Right.
But then response-efficacy was more like, will this thing actually work?
It's a really fascinating distinction, and the paper actually takes it even further.
How so?
They used brain imaging to show that different parts of our brains light up depending on which type of efficacy we're thinking about.
Wow. So it's not just some abstract idea. There's actual measurable brain activity tied to this.
Absolutely. But before we get into all the details of the study, it's helpful to understand the existing research on perceived control. It's actually been a hot topic in psychology for quite a while.
I can see why.
Yeah.
I mean, feeling in control or lacking it can make a huge difference in how we approach things.
For sure. Like, research has shown that having a sense of control can help us cope with stress better, make positive changes in our lives, even boost cognitive performance.
Really?
But on the flip side, feeling out of control, that can lead to anxiety, depression, even some pretty strange behaviors.
Like what?
Like clinging to superstitions or seeing patterns where there aren't any. Our brains trying to create a sense of control even when it doesn't really exist.
That's both fascinating and kind of unsettling at the same time. Makes you wonder how much of our daily lives is driven by this need for control. But so this paper we're talking about, it takes it a step further by looking at self-efficacy and response-efficacy separately. Why is that distinction so important?
Because it really helps us understand how we make decisions. Before, researchers often looked at perceived control as just one big thing. But this study shows that while both self-efficacy and response-efficacy are important, our brains actually process them differently. And that can have a huge impact on our choices.
I'm starting to see why this would be important.
And this is especially valuable for leaders, administrators, managers,
Yeah, makes sense.
anyone who's making decisions and guiding others.
Okay, I'm seeing how this could be really helpful for people in those roles. But let's get into the study itself. How did they actually measure these different types of efficacy?
Well, they designed these two really clever games. So for self-efficacy, they had this bar game where participants had to hit a moving target with, a bar.
Okay.
And they would change the target size, making it easier or harder to hit.
So the bigger the target, the easier it is to hit.
Exactly. And the easier it is to hit, the higher the self-efficacy.
Oh, so they were literally controlling people's, I got this.
And then for response-efficacy, they had a card game.
How did that work?
So in this game, participants learned about different decks of cards. Each deck had different odds of winning. So this manipulated their response efficacy because they were learning which action, choosing which deck were most likely to get them that desired outcome.
Clever. So they're playing these games, they're learning about the odds. What happens next?
Well, then they brought in the brain scans. They used fMRI to watch what was happening in their brains while they did 3 tasks. A rating task, a play task, and then a choice task.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one.
Sure.
Starting with the rating task, what went on there?
Okay, so for this one, they showed participants both the bar and the card stimuli at the same time. But then a cue would tell them to focus on either the bar or the card. And then they had to rate their confidence in either hitting the target, so that's self-efficacy, or winning with the card, which is response-efficacy.
So they're basically looking at how the brain reacts to each type of efficacy separately.
Exactly. And what they found were these distinct neural patterns in 2 key areas, the DACC and the MPFC.
Okay.
These areas showed different activation patterns depending on whether someone was thinking about their ability to actually do something, like self-efficacy, or how likely that action was to lead to a good outcome, response-efficacy.
So even at this early stage, our brains are already separating these 2 aspects of control.
Yeah, pretty cool, right? But of course, we don't just evaluate things in isolation. We need to bring it all together to actually make a choice.
That's true. So how do they study that?
That's where the play task comes in. In this one, they showed the bar and card together. But this time, they didn't tell them which one to focus on. Participants had to decide if they wanted to play the game based on both pieces of information.
So they had to consider both their ability to hit the target and how likely they were to win something. I bet they were way more likely to play when they felt good about both of those things.
You got it. And their brain activity actually showed that.
Really?
Yeah, when they decided to play, there was a ton of activity in areas linked to reward processing.
Like which ones?
like the VMPFC, the OFC, and the ventral striatum.
Okay, before we go any further, can we pause for a sec and talk about what those brain areas actually do?
Of course. So think of the VMPFC as like your brain's value assessor.
Hmm?
It helps you weigh pros and cons, especially when it comes to control. The OFC is all about predicting rewards.
So it's the part that gets excited about good things potentially happening.
Exactly. And the ventral striatum. That's your brain's pleasure center. It lights up when you're anticipating something good.
I see. That makes things much clearer. So back to the play task. People are seeing the bar, the cards,
Yeah.
and their brains are basically weighing the potential reward against their confidence in hitting the target.
Exactly. And they also saw activity in another area, the DLPFC.
What does that one do?
Well, this one seemed to be more about explaining choices.
Okay.
So after deciding to play or not, they had to say whether they based their decision more on the bar. And during that reflection, the DLPFC would light up.
So it's like our brains trying to make sense of our own decisions after the fact.
Right, like the DLPFC is the narrator of our decision-making process.
That's a great way to put it. So we've covered rating and playing. There's one more task, right?
Yeah.
The choice task.
Yes, and this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, in the choice task, participants were given 2 different options of the hit the target game, and each option had a different bar and card combination.
So different levels of self-efficacy and response-efficacy.
Exactly. And they had to choose which option they preferred to play.
So now it's not just about deciding whether to play at all. It's about choosing between 2 scenarios with different levels of control and reward.
Right, and that's where it gets really interesting.
Did they find that people leaned more towards one type of efficacy over the other?
Well, to figure that out, they used computational modeling. Basically, they tested out 4 different models.
What kind of models?
Okay, so one model was based on the idea that only self-efficacy mattered. Another one was where only response-efficacy mattered. Then one where both mattered equally.
Okay.
And finally, a model that considered both self-efficacy and response-efficacy, but also took into account the overall expected value.
So they were really testing out different theories about how our brains weigh these factors when making decisions.
Exactly. So drum roll, please.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Which model won?
The winner was the integrated model.
So people were taking both their likelihood of success and the potential reward into account.
Yes. Our brains aren't just focusing on one thing, they're considering all these different factors.
That makes sense, but it's probably not as simple as just adding those 2 things together, right? Because everyone's different, their motivations might lead them to prioritize one factor over the other.
Exactly, and that's where the DACC, remember our brain's control center?
Yeah.
That's where it really comes into play. They found that people with high achievement motivation...
People who are really driven to learn and improve.
Right. They showed more distinct activity in the DACC.
Interesting.
When processing self-efficacy versus response-efficacy.
So for them, the balance between can I do it and is it worth it is even more pronounced in their brains.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about motivation either. They also found that people with a strong general sense of self-efficacy.
People who generally believe they can overcome challenges.
Right. They tended to give more weight to self-efficacy when making choices.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy happening in the brain.
That's a good way to put it.
This is all so fascinating, but let's try to connect it back to the real world for a sec. How does this research help leaders and managers?
Well, it gives them a much better understanding of how their team members make decisions.
How so?
Imagine you're a manager and you're trying to delegate a new project. This research tells you that it's not enough to just think about someone's skills and experience.
You also need to consider their self-efficacy.
Right. Their belief in their own ability to handle the challenge.
So even if someone has all the right skills on paper, if they don't believe they can do it, they might struggle.
Exactly. And that can actually affect their performance, even if it's subconscious. So the question becomes, how do you boost self-efficacy in your team?
Right. How do you do that?
Well, you can start by setting really clear expectations and goals. When people know exactly what's expected of them, they're more likely to feel confident.
It's like having a clear roadmap instead of just being told to go wander around aimlessly.
Exactly. Providing opportunities for skill development and training can also make a huge difference.
When people feel like they're growing and expanding their capabilities, their self-efficacy naturally goes up.
Right. And don't forget the power of positive feedback and recognition. Celebrating those successes, big and small, can really reinforce those feelings of competence and mastery.
This is reminding me of how important autonomy and empowerment are in the workplace. Giving people ownership over their work seems like a great way to boost both self-efficacy and the response efficacy.
You're absolutely right. But just like with those different brain regions, everyone's wired a little differently.
That's true.
Some people love challenging tasks that push them outside their comfort zone, while others need more support and encouragement to feel confident.
And some people might be more driven by the end result, while others prioritize the process and the learning along the way.
Exactly. It's all about recognizing those individual differences.
Okay, so effective leadership isn't about using a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about understanding your team members, their motivations, and how they weigh these different factors when making decisions. This research is giving us a whole new way to look at leadership and teamwork.
I think so too.
But this goes beyond just the workplace, right? How can understanding self-efficacy and response-efficacy help us in our personal lives?
It's all about making more conscious choices. You know, we often go through life on autopilot, making decisions based on gut feelings.
Or assumptions.
Yeah, but when you start breaking down those decisions, you can see the self-efficacy and response-efficacy at play.
It's like shining a light on those unconscious processes that are actually driving our choices.
That's a great way to put it. Can you think of an example of how this might work in a real-life situation?
So let's say you're thinking about taking up a new hobby, like learning to play the guitar. Your self-efficacy would be your belief that you can actually learn it. Like, do I have any musical talent? Can I stick with it?
That's the I got this factor.
Right. And then your response-efficacy would be your belief that learning guitar will lead to something positive. Like, will I enjoy playing? Will I be able to play with others? So by considering both your self-efficacy and response-efficacy, you can make a more informed decision about whether or not to pursue this new hobby.
Right. It's about aligning your choices with your goals and values.
So we've seen how this research applies to leaders, managers, and even to our own personal choices. What I'm taking away from this is that by understanding these dynamics, we can become more aware of what's driving our decisions, whether we're leading a team or just trying to figure out our next move.
It's all about harnessing that power of perceived control to reach our goals.
And live more fulfilling lives.
Yeah, it highlights just how complex and nuanced the human brain is.
Always weighing things, making calculations, and striving for that sense of agency in the world.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Think about how you cultivate self-efficacy and response-efficacy in your own life. Are there areas where you could strengthen those feelings of control? Maybe by setting clearer goals, seeking out challenges, or focusing on the positive impacts of your actions.
It's all about that ongoing process of understanding ourselves and our motivations.
Exactly. By harnessing the power of perceived control, we can make more deliberate choices, embrace new opportunities, and navigate all the complexities of life with more confidence and purpose.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into self-efficacy, response efficacy, and all the fascinating ways our brains work.